Hello and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes Webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Walljasper along with Tribune football beat writer Dave Matter. Dave, we've been gone from the webcast for 2 weeks. Quite a little bit has happened.
A little bit.
We'll go in order. On Thursday, we get some stunning news. On a Thursday, we get some stunning news that Gary Pinkel has gotten a DWI, which is something that I certainly never would have imagined waking up to. Just your thoughts on how Missouri handled that situation, how Gary Pinkel handled that situation.
I thought the damage control was pretty good, very swift. I thought he handled the apology very well. I thought he seemed very sincere and remorseful. TJ Moe, a couple days later, made the comment that Pinkel could write the book on how to make an apology, because I think he did everything that you're supposed to do. He didn't blame anybody but himself. He didn't make any excuses. He was pretty upfront about not necessarily all the details, but just being accountable for it. And really, if you're a public figure who has stored up a lot of credibility like he has, I think you're ultimately judged on how you handle the aftermath, not necessarily the mistakes. I think that a DWI in today's society, if you are someone who has a lot of credibility, that mistake is forgivable, but you cannot screw up the apology. And I don't think he did. I think I went to the Columbia Tiger Quarterback Club earlier this week, and he walked into a rousing standing ovation. And those are people that are going to support him either way. I think beating Kansas probably helps that cause, but I don't know if he'll take a huge hit. But I thought he handled it pretty well. You can debate whether he should have sat out 1 or 2 games instead of 1, but I think the monetary penalty that he got hit with maybe outweighs that, and the fact that he did miss a home game and senior day was pretty hard on him. So overall, I thought he handled it pretty well. I think public figures and people who are known by a lot of people can probably take some notes on how he handled it, because I thought he did a pretty good job.
Yeah, it was a pretty heavy financial penalty, $300,000 if that amount ends up being accurate. I mean, that's a whopper. I mean, that's a lot for a couple of glasses of wine. So yeah, and then the public embarrassment, obviously, I think is the punishment in itself. I mean, that became obviously national news, which he didn't have a problem with. So yeah, I thought Missouri handled it pretty well. Crisis management hasn't always been their forte, but they, that day they have a press conference. I thought he probably should have been the one at that press conference instead of Mike Alden, but he did do a separate one on Monday, which is a wise move, because then it didn't become right before the KU game. He didn't have to answer a bunch of questions about that when people want to talk about football. So overall, I mean, they got by it. It's going to be a little bit of an embarrassment, a little bit of a hit for him, obviously, because I think that will always be kind of at the end of the bio. By the way, also got a DWI, and here's the video of it. I mean, so that's something you just got to live with. But other than that, in 11 years, that was really the first time I'd really heard of much negative about him, which is why, I guess that was why it was so surprising, because he was not a guy that you ever heard even rumors about.
Right, and to his credit also, and you wrote about this last week, I like the fact that he didn't have a problem with the scrutiny and the media attention. It seemed like some people in the media and wanted to apologize for having to report on this story, but it was a major news story, and he didn't have a problem with it. I don't know why people in our industry should have a problem with it.
All right, without Pinkel, they get into a lot of trouble against Texas Tech. They trail by 2 touchdowns, have to have a fourth quarter comeback, and really kind of a little bit of a lucky play there at the end to hold off Texas Tech and win. Sort of a similar deal against Kansas. It wasn't close at the end, but also a very slow start against a team they're heavily favored to beat and end up winning. So 7-5, they finish up. Your thoughts, is that a successful season considering all the twists and turns of it?
I think you have to take into consideration some of the stuff that happened to this team with the injuries, but 7-5 is 7-5, and that's nowhere near where we thought this team was capable of before the year. I thought 9-3 was sort of a good baseline expectation for this team. Some teams in the Big 12 were better than we thought. Some teams weren't as good, but at the end of the season, Missouri went 3-5 against teams that are going to play in bowls. Other than maybe Texas, I don't think you can say they beat a pretty good team. And Texas has been down on some weeks this year. Missouri should have won that Arizona State game. I thought they were at least in position to maybe win that Baylor game. And those are the two that will probably haunt them a little bit. The K-State game was probably not as close as that final score indicated, but for all the injuries this team went through, a lot of teams deal with injuries, and Missouri had some key players out. They also probably weren't counting on getting the kind of year they got out of Henry Josie until he was hurt. So I think that was sort of a positive surprise, where you have the injuries to Elvis Fisher and Will Ebner and Grant Russell. You can't expect necessarily. But 7-5, I think this program has done better over the course of the last 4 years to where you look at 7-5 and say that's not good enough.
Yeah, I think they would have needed to at least win 8 for me to consider it a successful year. When you look at it, I think there was 3 games that really could have gone either way. Arizona State, Texas Tech, Texas A&M. They won 2 of those 3, so I guess if nothing else, you could say it could have been worse.
Yeah.
I don't think the K-State game was as close as it looked. I don't think the Oklahoma game was as close as it looked, and I don't think the Baylor game was as close as the final score would indicate. So it's going to look like they lost a bunch of close games, which they did, but really, to me, of all those, only the Arizona State game was truly like a last possession type game.
Yeah.
So it was just an okay year, I thought. The fact that they lost Josie at the end, that was, a bad thing, not just for this year, but for next year. But they end up kind of winning the games without him that they would have won anyway. So I don't know that you can count the Henry Josie injury as devastating towards what happened during the season.
Right, absolutely. They maintained their bowl streak, but in today's college football, you only have to win 6 games. They were going to go to a bowl either way if they would have beaten Kansas or lost to Texas Tech. So I don't think that should be the bar for this program anymore. They're probably going to go to the bottom Big 12 bowl anyway. So and it's not going to get any easier next year, obviously.
And what are the bowl scenarios now for them?
Well, Mike Alden kind of spelled it out at the Tiger Quarterback Club earlier this week, and Missouri's basically one of 3 Big 12 teams for the final 2 guaranteed spots in the Big 12. It'd be unrealistic to think that Missouri will go ahead of Baylor or Texas at this point. They beat Texas, could end up with the same record, but it's still Texas, and Missouri is leaving the Big 12, so there's no reason to expect them to jump Texas in the pecking order. Those bottom 2 bowls are the Meineke Car Care Bowl of Texas, formerly known as just the Texas Bowl in Houston, where Missouri barely showed up to a couple of years ago when they lost to Navy. And then the Pinstripe Bowl, which is just in its 2nd year. It's played at Yankee Stadium in New York. K-State played Syracuse there last year. That's looking like the most likely place that Missouri goes. They play a team from the Big East. Looks like that could be Rutgers. Maybe not the tropical, location you expect for a bowl game, but kind of a cool atmosphere if you can afford it. It could be a good place for fans to go, a little bit different. But right now that's looking like where it could shake out. If, in fact, they don't go to one of those guaranteed bowl spots because there's another team out there, Iowa State or A&M, there's about 5 or 6 bowls that will need an at-large candidate because their conferences didn't supply them with enough teams. And those are the kind of bowls that, have the big, long sponsor names like the Beef O'Brady's Bowl or a few others that are not very, not very storied or not very traditional. So that could be where you end up.
All right. And then lastly, a little bit more in the SEC. We've seen a certain amount of fallout in Missouri's recruiting from this move to the SEC, either from Missouri's move to the SEC or from Missouri's so-so season. Just your thoughts on, A, what we've seen so far as the class they did have, winnowed down to what they have now, and B, on Missouri's strategy going forward with the SEC, since Gary Pinkel has now kind of discussed that.
Yeah, well, there's a few kids out there who are waffling that were committed at one point. Either they aren't committed anymore or they're sort of leaving their options open. Pinkel came out earlier this week and said they think that has more to do with the move to the SEC. They expected this to be sort of a transition year, and he said, his quote was they threw a curveball at some of these kids. But I think 7-5 probably has as much to do with that more than anything, especially when you consider one of them, Evan Bain, big offensive lineman from Lee Summit, just took a trip to the Alabama-Auburn game to visit Auburn. So apparently playing in the SEC is not a problem for him. That they are going to have to shift their tactics around a little bit, and Pinkel has talked about that. They're going to move a couple of their coaches out of Texas. Still have a presence there, but not as much as they do right now. They're going to focus on the city of Atlanta and then put 2 coaches in the state of Florida. They said they've done a lot of analysis on this. They compare Atlanta to Dallas as far as Dallas providing a lot of Big 12 players. They feel like Atlanta is the equivalent to that in the SEC. So Pinkel was saying that him and his staff are going to do everything they can over the next 2 months to get to those high schools, introduce themselves to coaches, and just try to create some relationships and build up some credibility, some familiarity with the people there. So that's the plan. I think it's going to take a while. Surely you're going to find some kids there that probably aren't, getting much attention from Georgia or Florida or some of the more established teams down there that might want to take a look at Missouri. And that's kind of been Missouri's MO in the state of Texas anyway. They're not going after the kids who are also considering Oklahoma or Texas necessarily. So we'll see if it works in a different part of the country.
This will be a big December for them because they really, in terms of numbers or even quality, I think last year was kind of a snoozer of a recruiting class. None of those guys even played as true freshmen. And if this one turns out to be bad, now you've got a pretty hollowed out program heading into the SEC. And this is kind of a bad year for it to be bad because it's actually a good year for high-end recruits in the state of Missouri. Obviously, Dorial Green Beckham, who has not decided yet in Missouri, I guess is still in the mix to some extent at least. He hasn't ruled them out. And then Deron Neal over in St. Louis, who was going to Oklahoma. And now if Boehm decommits and doesn't come to Missouri, to whiff on the top 3 guys in the state of Missouri would be a little rough going to the SEC next year.
Absolutely. That's the one place you need to capitalize on, the one turf that doesn't change when you make a conference move. I will say this, historically, Pinkel staff is pretty good at closing the deal if they get a kid to take an official visit in December or January, and right now they're lining up a lot of those visits. Boehm included is supposed to be here next month. So if they can sell these kids when they get them on campus, maybe they can salvage this class. But it's going to be a tough year. Just because of the move to the SEC and when you're coming off a disappointing season, I think you almost have to expect it to be a little down this year.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us this week. Come back next week. We'll discuss the bowl arrangement and where Tigers will be headed over the holidays.